Hey everyone, and welcome to Forgotten FNQ. I'm Shani, and I am so glad that you're pulling up a chair and grabbing a quiet cuppa with me today. Whether you're listening in the car or doing the dishes, maybe you're even out on a morning walk, I really do thank you for tuning in. This podcast has been a real labour of love. And together, I hope to shed some light on the stories that I feel like they're kind of left behind. These are the stories that should never be forgotten. So before we head into the heavy stuff, I just want to take a moment and step back in time, right? So this episode introduces the unsolved murder of two beautiful women right here in the heart of the Atherton Tablelands at Cherry Tree Creek. So 35 years ago, all the way back to 1991. So picturing what life was like back then in Atherton, there's no smartphones in your pocket, no social media, there's no instant messaging, no jumping on an app to check on your mates or where they're at. If you want to catch up with somebody here on the Tablelands in 1991, you just lean against the tray of their ute outside the local pub, or you hang around outside the newsagents on Saturday morning until they walk past, kind of thing. So down on the coast, far north Queensland, it's all beautiful sunny beaches, palm trees, reef boats. But when you leave that coastal highway and you head up into the winding ranges of our tablelands here, life, it just moves to a completely different, quieter rhythm. So you've got Atherton, which back in 1991 was a really tight-knit community. It's built on rich red volcanic soil. There's endless cornfields, dairy farms, and everybody puts in a lot of bloody hard work. So everybody there, from what I've heard, knows your name, knows your family, and probably what your granddad did for a living. So then just a short drive up the range, nestled in the granite hills, is Herberton. It's old, timber train tracks, historic mining routes, and quiet streets. On a warm summer afternoon, it's absolute magic up here. But in late July, the Tablelands really shows you a completely different personality. So back on Friday, July 26th, 1991, a brutal winter cold snap had hit the region. Down in Herberton, the temperature plummeted to an absolutely freezing minus 1.7 degrees Celsius. So we're talking thick, crusty frost all over the grass. The windshields across the entire Tablelands are coated in solid sheets of ice. It's the kind of night where people told me they just stayed indoors, huddled around their wood fires, and they just watched the fog roll in through their windows, kind of cold. People also tell me that they felt safe and that it felt quiet, but beneath that quiet small town veneer, the backyard here has always held on to some pretty dark secrets. So in this series, we are stepping off the beaten track to uncover, hopefully, the truth that was left behind that day, because stories this raw should never be forgotten. So to really understand what happened back on the Tablelands in 1991, we really have to talk about the world that these people were living in. And specifically, I feel like the police culture in regional Queensland at the time is most important to understand this story. So we're only a few short years out, really, from the Fitzgerald inquiry, which absolutely blew open systemic corruption, institutional inertia across Queensland, right? But while the major cities were slowly starting to reform, all the small regional stations across the far north often still operated like, I guess, their own little isolated kingdoms with the police, right? So in towns like Atherton and Herberton, the local cops weren't really just local law enforcement officers. They were deeply embedded into the social fabric of these towns. So they drank at the same pubs, they played in the same local sports clubs, they knew everybody's personal business. Investigative work in rural outposts back then really relied on gut feelings, I guess, informal chats over beers, a very strong unspoken push to keep things quiet and to help protect a small town's reputation. So if there was a row at home, it was almost always written off as just a private family matter. Crime scenes were often handled with a casualness that would make modern forensic teams cringe. And once an official narrative was set by senior officers, challenging it was kind of nearly impossible. So it's an era where authority was rarely questioned by the public. So when these two local women vanish into a freezing mountain night, that deeply entrenched culture didn't just slow things down. It kind of shaped the entire narrative before a proper search had even begun. So because this is a deep dive, I don't want to just tell you what happened to these women. I want you to know who they were. I want you to understand the weight that they were carrying in the middle of 1991. So let's first talk about Julie-Anne Leahy. Julie-Anne was just 26 years old, and if you ask anyone who knew her, they'll tell you that she had a really big heart, but her life was far from easy. So she lived at Danzier Drive in Atherton with her husband, Alan Leahy. Alan is a man known in police intelligence records under an alias, Alan Noel Souter. So that's Soutter. I will put up the article on Facebook page that shows his previous crimes that the police knew him for, but we don't need to go into that at the moment because we'll focus on Julie-Anne, who was, she's a devoted mother, fiercely protective of her kids. She's got a little 5-month-old baby. But from what I understand, behind the doors of Danzier Drive, the atmosphere, it comes across as volatile. So local police had already been called out to the home on multiple occasions for domestic violence incidents. As I understand, none of them were physical violence, but there was a lot of verbal aggression and financial abuse. So they were in financial hardship, and Julie-Anne seemed to be living in quite a pressure cooker, stressed, isolated. She even contacted Centrelink to get a single parent pension. So, you could look at that as kind of desperate for a way out. So her house wasn't just home to her, Alan, and her kids. Julie-Anne's younger sisters were actually living in the house with them as well at the time. So Julie-Anne has taken in her sisters to keep a roof over their heads, stepped into a protective maternal role, I guess like she was described as always doing. So think about that dynamic for a second, right? You've got a young 26-year-old mum, including a 5-month-old infant, not to mention the other kids, an unstable marriage with a history of police call-outs, and her younger sisters are all crammed under one roof in a small Atherton home. So the financial stress, the personality clashes, the noise, walking on eggshells, the tension in that house in late July 1991, it must have felt pretty suffocating. So right in the middle of all that chaos was her best friend, Vikki Arnold. Vikki was 27 years old, And for all accounts and purposes, she's described as a really organised, deeply reliable accountant who's wildly respected for her sharp mind and really caring nature. So where Julie-Anne's world's turbulent, Vikki's is kind of the polar opposite with absolute stability. So she's the friend who showed up with a plan, with a warm heart, and always organised. And if you look at Vikki's life leading up to that final weekend, she seemed like a woman heavily anchored into her future. So her plan is completely full, right? On Friday morning, she's scheduled to travel early to Cairns with work colleagues for professional training. Cairns is about an hour and a half drive from Atherton, down the range. She had a meeting lined up to sign tax returns for her friend, Mr. Wilkie. And she'd already bought and beautifully wrapped a birthday gift for Julie-Anne's 11-year-old daughter, whose party and birthday was the next day. So she's also booked in to attend a Saturday night family barbecue at other family friends, the Wilkinsons' home. So every single detail in Vikki's life, it shows a woman moving forward with purpose. You know, she's got plans, she's excited, birthday parties, you name it. She wasn't running away from anything. She wasn't acting recklessly. And she seemed to be a solid rock for Julie-Anne. She's a loyal confidant and friend who listened and supported her friend. Okay, so now that we've introduced you to the women, let's step directly back into that cold, dark reality of Friday night, July 26th, 1991. So the winter fog's rolling thick off the ridges. It's wrapped around Atherton. It's freezing the grass solid, and the streets are probably quiet. Vikki's personal car's parked on the footpath directly outside the Leahy home on Danzier Drive. So sitting plain as day, now keep this in mind for later, on the seat inside her car is her purse. Inside that purse is her ID, all of her personal cards, and $500 in cash. So this $500 is money she had arranged to pay a local blacksmith on the weekend, on that very same weekend. So what really happened inside Danzier Drive that night? Now, to answer that, I feel like we have to examine the official statement given by who is supposedly the last person who admits to seeing them alive, and that's Julie-Anne's husband, Alan Leahy. And folks, when you break down Alan's versions of events, it's a timeline that just, well, to me, it simply defies logic, right? So Alan tells police investigators that on Friday evening, he's just chilling out in the lounge room at Danzier Drive on a beanbag. He claims he fell asleep on that beanbag directly in front of the TV. So according to Alan, he then wakes up at 12:25 a.m. He lights a cigarette, rubs his eyes, and looks across the room, where sitting quietly together were Julie-Anne and Vikki. They weren't fighting, they weren't upset. Alan just claims the two women are casually playing a game of Scrabble. So shortly after he wakes up, he reckons the classic 1931 horror movie Frankenstein has come on the television. Alan reckons he watches a bit of the movie when the women just out of the blue make an announcement. So despite the bitter, it's minus 1.7 degrees sub-zero cold, remember? So despite the frost thick on the ground, they tell him that they've decided to go on a random spontaneous late night fishing trip to Lake Tinaroo. Alan claims he stayed behind to look after the 5-month-old that they have. He states the women walk out into the freezing night, load up their fishing gear into Julie-Anne's white Nissan 4-wheel drive, and drive away from the house at approximately 12:45 a.m. So, in the next detail of Alan's statement is the part that makes my jaw drop. Alan claims that right after the Nissan pulls out of the driveway, an electrical circuit breaker in the house suddenly trips and plunges Danzier Drive into pitch darkness. Because of this power outage, Alan reckons he had to walk through the house and manually reset all the digital clocks. So he explicitly tells police that when he's finished resetting that final clock in the house, he looked directly at the glowing numbers to verify the time. According to him, it's exactly 1:03 a.m. I just find that a remarkably specific alibi. Isn't it like a timeline that's anchored by a sleeping beanbag, a late night horror film, and just a really convenient power outage that forces him to look at a clock? Anyway, when you take Alan Leahy's 12:45 a.m. timeline and then test it, it just, to me, shatters like sugar glass. So first, let's take a look at what the women were wearing. So when the women are eventually found weeks later, they're lightly clothed and they're in thongs. Does anyone believe that two women planning a late night fishing trip on a sub-zero mountain lake just waltz out the door in light summer clothes with nothing but wind cheaters and ploggers? And secondly, also the thing that struck me was when police eventually inspect the white Nissan 4-wheel drive, the baby capsule's still in the back. So, I don't know about you, and correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't you unclip the baby seat and leave it in the house, just in case the baby could be transported safely in an emergency? Like, you're leaving after midnight for a fishing trip that could possibly go, for however long. And for all accounts and purposes, Julie-Anne's a very doting and fiercely loving mother, right? I just don't know if it makes sense to drive into the dead of the night in the middle of winter with an empty baby seat while her baby's left behind without one. Anyway, we'll take a look at the streets that night. So there's an Atherton resident, who I won't name because he's still a local, comes forward with a statement that absolutely torpedoes this midnight Scrabble narrative. So he tells the authorities that he saw Julie-Anne's white Nissan 4-wheel drive driving through the main street of Atherton, and it's heading towards Herberton much, much earlier in the evening. So he places that vehicle on the roundabout somewhere between 9 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. And he saw something else too, something that the official police narrative tried desperately to ignore. He states very clearly that he sees two women in the front seats and a male passenger sitting still in the back. So if this guy is right, the women are already out on the road hours before Alan claims they even left. That means they weren't playing board games at midnight. It means that they were probably already pulled into a dangerous trajectory, and it would seem that they weren't alone. Now, this is also the other bit that gets me, right? What happens on early Saturday morning, which is now July 27th? A lady called Sharon's a Malanda dairy farmer, and she's working part-time as a driveway attendant at a local Atherton service station. Right? So it's a quiet, freezing morning, and she opens up the servo at 6 a.m. At precisely 6:15 a.m., a white work van pulls onto the driveway. The driver is Alan Leahy. So the sun's not even fully up over the horizon yet, and it's only been, according to him, 5.5 hours since the women had supposedly left for this night of fishing. Yet, Alan walks up to Sharon in a state of high alert. He asks her if she's seen Julie-Anne. And then, get this, he drops a timeline that completely contradicts the story he would later give to police. He tells Sharon that Julie-Anne had gone fishing at 2 a.m. and was already missing. Just think about the psychology of that moment, guys. Why is a husband declaring his wife officially missing to a petrol station cashier at 6:15 in the morning when, by his own logic, they were just out on an overnight fishing trip? Why did he tell the cashier 2 a.m. but then later tells police 12:45 a.m.? I don't know if he's this frantic, worried husband or he's actively planting a narrative across town within a small community before the sun even comes up. Anyway, later that day, police accept Alan's fishing story without hesitation. So they turn to organise a search towards Lake Tinaroo. And I guess looking back, they're looking exactly where they're told to look. So he's steering them in that direction. Meanwhile, Vicky's car's still on the footpath outside Danzier Drive with her purse, her cash, her ID. It's all just still sitting on the seat. The birthday present for Julie-Anne's daughter for that day. And, she just never came back. She never came back for her money. She never came back for the gift. She never really even came back for her life. So the trap here, it's already snapped shut. So the disappearance of Vikki Arnold and Julie-Anne Leahy, it doesn't really begin at Cherry Tree Creek. It begins in what I feel is a shifting timeline of a husband who lives in a household under pressure. It begins with an alibi that I reckon's made of wet cardboard. There's an empty baby capsule, an early morning trip to the servo, and a mysterious male passenger spotted in the back seat heading into the mountain fog. The authorities here want a tidy story. They want to believe two women just drove off into the night. I reckon the frost on that windshield tells a completely different story. Next time on Forgotten FNQ, we're going to step directly into the horror of the discovery. So 2 weeks after they vanish, trail riders are riding through the scrub at Cherry Tree Creek and uncover a scene of absolute savagery. We're going to break down the physical trauma, the slashes, the swelling, the 1.5 kilogram rock, and especially a gunshot wound that's entered a seat from behind, which I believe proves a third party was pulling the trigger. This is Forgotten FNQ, Cold Cases and Missing Persons. This is a community-driven investigation. The files may be old, but the memories are very much alive. And, it takes a whole community to break the silence. If you were on the Tablelands in July 1991, if you saw that white Nissan four-wheel drive, or if you have any information about the events of that weekend, please don't hesitate to speak up. Someone here knows something. We've also got an active community over on Facebook where you can view archival scene maps. I'm going to be putting up photographs of the car. Follow along. You could also contact our investigative team directly, and this can be completely confidential via email at fnqcoldcasefiles@hotmail.com. Here at Forgotten FNQ, we don't let the truth stay buried in the rainforest. We will not let these guys be forgotten. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll talk to you next episode.